You know all those YouTubers who find an old Mac in a dumpster and restore the thing to make it look brand new? They're masochists. All of them. How do I know? This year, I joined them. You know the saying, in for a penny, in for a pound? For old tech, it should be in for an old Mac, in for recapping the motherboard, replacing the RAM, cleaning up residue from an exploded battery, trying 5 storage adapters to find one that actually works, finding out that wasn't even the main problem, then spending hours scavenging forums for clues. And that's before we even get to the old software. I can stop any time, said no retro enthusiast ever. By the time you light up your first, you're hooked, and good luck avoiding the next vintage computer festival if it's anywhere near you. I picked up this old PowerBook 3400C from a graphic designer like 10 years ago, and I got this other Power Mac from a school this year. I'm building out a retro corner in my new office, so 2 months ago I decided to see if the PowerBook would boot. So I plugged it in, pressed the power button, and it actually boots up. But testing it out, I ran into some issues, like random crashes, or ejecting floppies only worked sometimes. I'm not deep into restoring old Macs. In fact, the last time I even opened one up was back in 2018, when I helped my sister with her 2011 MacBook Pro. So I thought it would be best to phone a friend.
Yeah, so I'm Steve from Mac 84. I am on the Mac 84 YouTube channel. I run that. And what I basically do is tinker around with old Apple stuff like it's 1995. So the first thing I usually do is just open it up, give it a general inspection. You never want to just power it on because you don't know what the state of the machine is in.
Oh.
I mean, really the best thing to do is to open it and take a look inside. I mean, a lot of these are going to have leaking batteries and stuff. And, it might have been last turned on 15 years ago. And it was fine then, but today, if you just plug it in, it's going to explode because battery leaked and capacitors are shorted and corroded. So before you plug it in, you should really open it and take a look inside.
So I guess do as I say and not what I did. After booting up this PowerBook, I opened it up and sure enough, it's a good thing I pulled out the battery because it was getting pretty crusty. I also talked to Colin from This Does Not Compute, and he mentioned I should also check the main battery. So I looked more carefully inside the main battery compartment, and there it is, some corrosion. So yeah, pull the PRAM battery, yank the main battery, and those are relatively painless operations. But I started inventorying all the little quirks I found on these machines so I could see what I could fix. Like the PowerBook just locked up sometimes. And the G4, well, there's a reason this thing was nicknamed the wind tunnel. Not only was it loud, that speaker had been bashed in at some point and sounded pretty ratty. When my kids come by, I want them to experience computing from the past 2 decades. At least that's my hope. I have a lot of work to get these things back in fighting shape. One of the coolest things back then was you didn't need any internet at all to do just about anything. Like all this software, it just works. Some of it needs a serial number or you have to put in the disk to play Lord of the Rings, but otherwise the internet wasn't sitting there trying to get into your life all the time. But today, the internet's everywhere and all our devices are connected. And that's why I'm happy to use today's sponsor, Surfshark. Not to sound too scary here, but wouldn't it be nice if you had a little protection, especially if you're on public Wi-Fi, or ways to make it so websites couldn't track you quite as easily? Now, I also have my own private WireGuard VPN. I use that a lot. But sometimes I just want to connect to a site that's restricted to some other country, or I'm on someone's public Wi-Fi and I just want that extra little bit of security knowing their router can't read my traffic. So I use Surfshark. It's easy to use on anything like my Mac, iPhone, or even Linux. Well, at least Ubuntu. Obviously, you have to trust Surfshark if you want to use them as your VPN too, but I like them and I haven't had any issues. So if you want that extra bit of protection or just to lift geo restrictions, sign up and enter code RedShirtJeff for an extra 3 months free or use my link in the description. But these 2 Macs were both from the era right before the internet was always on everywhere tracking you all the time. And they were both Apple at the top of their performance game. These 2 models were both pretty pricey, but the 3400 story is especially interesting.
So that's a crazy expensive laptop, but it was also the world's fastest laptop of any computer for like 6 months. And that's a pretty decent amount of time considering how fast technology was going in the 90s.
But the Macs around this time are pretty special to me. I owned a blue and white G3 and it was the first time I ever edited a video on my own computer. I made some really dumb videos like smashing printers, but it was awesome. I also found this old working GL1 camcorder and I loved editing like it was 1999. And I'm not unique here. A lot of people get into retro computing for the same kind of reason.
This was where I really got my first taste of production because my school had an AV club and it was pretty active, and we were lucky to have nice computers like this.
But enough reminiscing. Let's get right to it. I decided I wanted to restore both of these Macs so they'll last another 20 years or more. And who better to help than a dream team of Mac restoration specialists?
Hi, I'm Sean from Action Retro. Really into vintage computers, especially Macintoshes.
I remembered watching Sean's series on the world's fastest Mac G4 a couple years ago, and I don't have any aspirations to upgrade the thing as far as he did, but he obviously knew his way around this machine.
Not only is it beautiful, but it's the most powerful. It's kind of the cream of the crop, and they're very upgradable. I mean, the CPUs are on daughter cards, so you can find a faster MDD CPU, stick that in there. It's really extremely flexible.
That's good news. And, you know, this thing is more pro than the current Mac Pro. I mean, it has 4 hard drive bays, 2 optical drive bays, 4 RAM slots, a daughter card for up to 2 CPUs, Wi-Fi expansion, a built-in modem, gigabit Ethernet, FireWire and USB, AGP, and 4 PCI slots. Besides the weird power supply, this thing is a beast. The modern Mac Pro has everything soldered down, and even though it has some expansion slots, only a few cards actually work in it. My G4 is pretty loud though. This design was beautiful, but it was showing its age.
Apple was really starting to kind of push the boundaries of how much performance they could get out of CPUs in that form factor. I'm pretty sure the reason why the G5 got a completely different redesign and looks like a cheese grater is because they needed the airflow more than just to make it look cool. It has an interesting history to it. It was the last G4 machine before Apple switched to the G5 and the cheese grater design and all that. What's also kind of funny about it, and what makes it somewhat desirable to collectors these days, is it's the last machine that can natively run macOS 9, like, officially.
I didn't even think about that. I remember at the radio station I worked at, they had tons of software like Vox Pro and Pro Tools that didn't run on macOS 10 for a long time. Apple wanted to drag people into the OS 10 era, but it had a lot of growing pains. Sometimes you lose the context around these old machines, but that's part of why I love watching retro channels on YouTube. But Apple was still Apple, even back then. This cinema display uses a weird ADC plug and doesn't have any power plug. It pulls power through the G4's video card. That means it has a non-standard video card and a weird power supply.
Power supplies are starting to fail on them, and they're not a standard like PC ATX power supply. The pinout is different, and what's a real bummer is the power supply is not just a weird form factor and a weird pinout, but it also has a 25-volt DC rail coming out of it to support the monitor. And that's 25 volts DC. And like there aren't any PC power supplies that output that.
I started getting a vibe from Colin and the other YouTubers I talked to that retro computing isn't all just joy and nostalgia.
The better approach is if the power supply in one of those fails and you really care about an ADC monitor, try to repair the power supply if you can. You know, take it apart, figure it out, you know, or just find another one. Of course, those are getting expensive too, and those will probably fail at some point as well, but welcome to vintage computing, right?
Luckily, the power supply seemed stable, but this system did have issues. But first, I wanted to give it a good clean. I gave this new air blower a try, and it worked better than I expected. It's nice to not have to use canned air. After that, and a bit of elbow grease, this thing is looking almost new. I popped in a new PRAM battery too, and I'll put a link to all the parts and more details on my blog in the description, since this video isn't really a walkthrough. I tried upgrading the RAM to 2 gigs, which is the max this G4 takes, and the first time I did it, I ordered some PC 3200 RAM from OWC, which I found out would kinda work, but would also kinda not work. So I yanked that and got some PC 2700 RAM, which worked much better. I also decided to repaste the CPUs. Taking off the massive aluminum heatsink revealed the 2 G4s and a little crusty old thermal paste. If you have old paste or bad contact with the heatsink, the fans on this thing can get even louder, so that's one of the first things to check on an old machine if you have a lot of fan noise. I also upgraded the internal hard drive to an SSD, and the first adapter I tried was this cable CC adapter. Unfortunately, it seems like the G4 wasn't happy with it. It would boot sometimes but get stuck other times. I narrowed it down to it not supporting ATA's cable select feature, a feature that was pretty new at the time this machine was built. I replaced it with the StarTech.com adapter, and that solved my boot issue. I also tried getting macOS 9.2.2 installed, and eventually found out that you have to run a special version of 9.2.2 on this G4, and it was hidden away on one of the restore CDs. Go figure. So for now, I just went with 10.4 after Sean recommended it. A few more parts arrived too. That smashed-in speaker was easy enough to replace with one from eBay, and the install went perfect. Actually, a little too perfect, because now that the speaker works, it's absolutely ear-shattering how loud the startup bong gets. I even tried a few different ways to quiet down the boot sound, but nothing really worked. I also did a fan swap for the massive system fan and the two 60mm fans inside the power supply. That install was a little tricky since I wanted to do it without removing the power supply completely, but all's well that ends well. If you're doing a fan swap, make sure you get the right fans with high CFM ratings. You can't just throw in some silent Noctua fans and expect the system to run well. Also double check the fan connector pinouts. These things aren't quite standard like the 4-pin fan headers we have today. But with the new fans, how'd we do? Well, pretty good actually. Here's before where it was like 48 decibels. And afterwards, it's definitely still noisy, but a more respectable 41 decibels. Around this time, a care package showed up. Colin managed to find an original keyboard and mouse for the G4 thanks to Free Geek Twin Cities, so huge shout out to them. This system was coming together. I also threw in a USB 2.0 card, and this one with an NEC chipset just worked out of the box, giving me 4 USB 2.0 ports on the back. Getting files back and forth was a lot faster since I could use any of my old USB 2.0 flash drives. But faster still was gigabit Ethernet. The FireWire and USB ports are limited to around 400 megabits, but gigabit Ethernet could go faster. So I set up netatalk on a Raspberry Pi 5 to run an AppleTalk file server. It's crazy how many little retro projects out there run great on a Raspberry Pi. I call this one my Apple Pi, and I open sourced my Ansible playbook to set it up for my old Macs. So a few weeks in, I have this G4 running better than new. It boots up in like 12 seconds, and my file copies over the network get up to like 80 megabytes per second. And playing the original Halo on a machine that's even faster than the first Mac I ever beat Halo on, it's definitely worth it. I mean, I have to say that, otherwise how can I justify spending almost $400 on all these upgrades? But the G4 was built in 2002. That's only 5 years after the PowerBook 3400, but that 5 years made a huge difference. The 3400C was the best portable Apple made before Steve Jobs returned. And Apple actually rehired Jobs right before launching the 3400, but this laptop was Gil Amelio's brainchild. And we like to look at the clamshell iBook or the PowerBook G3 as the starting point that led to Apple's laptop dominance, but really, the 3400C, as thick and clunky as it was really where those things started. Colin was telling me about how Gil saw a hole in Apple's lineup.
He's like, you know, our laptops are really underserving that professional market. And the professional market, I mean, you know, you have a Mac Studio, so do I. That's where the margin really comes into play. So he basically said, you know what, we need to have a professional level laptop. That's the fastest thing it can be. That's the best computer it can be. And if it's expensive, so be it. As long as it's worth it, people will buy it. And the 3400 sold for $5,000 in 1997. And that's 97 money.
Apple really threw everything at this laptop.
What's actually cool about the 3400, and this kind of comes back to just them trying to go all out with that computer, is on the back, you probably notice there's an Ethernet jack built in. And having built-in Ethernet on a PowerBook like that was a big deal, because even with a lot of PC laptops, you had to buy a PC card for that. What's crazy about that port is not only is it 10 base T Ethernet, it's also a 33.6 modem. You can plug a phone line straight into it, and it's a 33.6 modem. What's crazier on top of that is included with the machine was an adapter that would let you use both at the same time. Why anyone would do that, I don't know, but like that's kind of how all out they went.
I mean, this machine is pretty crazy. You could get up to 128 megs of RAM, a 3+ gigabyte hard drive, a 12x CD-ROM, and up to a 240 megahertz PowerPC 603 chip. The one I had was a bit more modest, the low-end 180 megahertz model, but tucked away, there's even crazy features like a subwoofer built in behind the display. No wonder this thing's so thick. That thickness also makes it somewhat of a joy to work in. Almost everything's replaceable, and pretty much every screw inside is a Torx T8. They didn't use security screws back then. I was able to get files on and off the thing using this CF card adapter, but at least initially when I was booting the System 7.6 it came with, I had to use a utility called HFS Utils on my Mac Studio to copy files back and forth. I put the details on that in a blog post too. But I ran through testing everything. I found that the CD-ROM worked, for the most part. Sometimes it would cycle through reading something then give up. But the floppy drive worked, it just needs some work on the eject mechanism. And that PRAM battery was toast, but the lithium-ion battery actually runs the laptop for like 20 minutes. So that's kind of neat. I tried upgrading the hard drive to an SD card, and that worked, but I would also get weird issues with it. I also had some trouble formatting it sometimes. Long story short, I ran into some of the same issues I think Sean hit on his PowerBook 1400. I tested like 5 different hard drive replacements, and ultimately only one seemed to be completely reliable, but there were still random crashes. In the meantime, I could at least get System 7.6 running somewhat reliably, and even tested out some of the old voices I remember back in Apple's early text-to-speech days well before Siri.
The light you see at the end of the tunnel is the headlamp of a fast approaching train.
And my son was already getting hooked on Eric's Solitaire sampler, just like I remember back in the day. But in the course of debugging the drive issue, I also found out this machine can't seem to read 700 megabyte CDR disks. I went as far as to buy old stock 650 meg CDRs to confirm it could read them. And I even tested both in my ancient Apple II CD-ROM, which also had no problem with older CDs, but couldn't read newer 700 megabyte disks. I also wanted to see if I could get a USB card to work, and unfortunately, Apple's little USB driver utility won't allow me to install it on the 3400. Things got really frustrating though. File copies would stall out and the PowerBook would just crash during boot or sometimes right after boot. That's when I started testing more boot drives. I actually had to snip a pin off this SIBA adapter, and I also tried a little mini PCI Express SSD with this adapter. Some adapters worked better than others, but that crashing issue could have been the death of this machine. I spent a few days debugging it, and I was gonna give up, but I tried one last thing. Through the magic of buying another, I picked up another used 3400 off eBay. The listing had no specs, and it looked like something melted off some of the plastic, so chances are it was gonna be toast. I was hoping it would at least have some RAM or a spare hard drive cable I could test. But I opened it up and besides a little dog hair, this was actually an incredibly lucky find. My machine was the base model, 180 MHz with 48 megs of RAM. This junker? It was the top of the line model. It had a 240 MHz 604 EV, which was also a newer process node, so the chip itself was smaller, even though it's faster. And it had a rare 128 megabyte RAM module installed, plus a new hard drive cable. I gutted my system and swapped out everything, and I booted both of them up, and wouldn't you know, the eBay machine boots up too. So now I have a working spare, though the mouse button's broken and the bezel's toast. But this is huge because now I have working spare parts for almost everything. Even the old battery holds a charge still. And that 128 meg RAM module seems to make all the difference too. It's either that or something on the motherboard, because now my 3400C is running macOS 8.6 like a champ. The one thing I can't figure out yet is AppleShare. It gets an IP address from my router, but no matter what I try, I can't get it to connect to my Apple Pi, at least not yet. I'll leave that problem for future Jeff. For now, I'll let it fly some toasters like I used to do on my old Mac II CI. But this Mac can also play all my old shareware games like Spin Doctor, Super Maze Wars, Spectre VR, and Glypha 3. Just like on the G4, there's nothing like playing these games on real hardware. No emulation is quite the same. I still have a couple things to do, including replacing all the electrolytic caps. Electroboom just did a video on how those caps degrade over time. It's better to replace them now while the computer's still working. If they start leaking, they could cause permanent damage.
So when I overload the capacitor and it bulges, those tiny grooves on the top break open, allowing the release of the pressurized gases.
I'm also going to get this Pi SCSI adapter working soon, and I might pick up a blue SCSI too. It uses the cheaper Pi Pico.
That whole scene, there's a lot of options these days, which is just awesome to see, especially when it's integrating commodity in quotes, hardware these days like the Raspberry Pi Pico. It's $4 and you can get them at Micro Center and just solder it onto this PCB and off you go. It's just wild.
It's cool to see how many community projects are out there keeping these old Macs alive. But it's been a journey. Plugging in this camera the first time brought me right back to high school when I edited my first video. But I also remember how Apple always seemed to be a little too hooked on magic. From the PC card having a weird auto-eject mechanism to the crazy ADC and SCSI connectors, I think some people don't realize Apple used to be even worse at form over function.
Well, it's hilarious because everybody gives Apple crap about dongles these days, but like they were proprietary dongles back in the day. I mean, HDI 45 was the video out proprietary thing for the first generation of Power Macs. And you had HDI 30, I believe, for the PowerBook SCSI. And then every PowerBook had either a different Ethernet adapter or something else. And it's like, yeah, they were far worse back in the day. At least most of the stuff is USB-C.
I also had to pull my bent paperclip out of retirement because Apple was too cool for an eject button on the floppy drive. I think every Mac user used to have a stash of paperclips to eject floppies and stuck CDs. But in the end, was all this worth it? No, at least I wouldn't say for most people. For me, yeah, the nostalgia's worth it, but this G4, it eats through 200 watts of power when it's just sitting there doing nothing. Heck, this Pi Zero 2W is 200 times more power efficient, and it doesn't even have a fan. But you know what the Pi doesn't do? It doesn't run Halo exactly how I remember from my childhood. But no, I wouldn't recommend getting into retro computing unless you really want that nostalgia high and you're willing to sacrifice a lot of time for it.
I've made it my goal to try to, at some point, replicate my original high school video and audio workflow and be able to kind of get back to that point just to either open up old projects that I might have lying around or even just to have fun exploring it and seeing some of the things that maybe I couldn't afford back then, which is a great reason to get into some of this old hardware.
If you're not in it for the nostalgia and you can't stand a little pain, you can emulate a lot on Basilisk or Sheepsaver. Also, there are modern ports for a lot of old games like Nanosaur, Bugdom, and even Glypha 3, which is on Steam. In the end, I think the biggest driver, though, is the retro community.
There really is a huge outpouring of support and just love for these old systems. I mean, there's a lot of cool history about it. That might be some of why we do what we do. I mean, there's people creating awesome new hardware projects and software projects and all sorts of stuff. And by and large, like I've had very few negative experiences, like doing like so much. And I've talked to so many people and bought and sold things and traded things and repaired things. And like 9 times out of 10, you're going to meet a fantastic person that's going to help you because they want to see you succeed. They're going to have the same excitement that you have about this product or this system that you're working on. And they want to see what you do with it, or, you know, could you push it further than it's supposed to be pushed, you know?
And I really couldn't end it on a better note. The reason I'm sharing this journey with you is partly to justify the pain and misery of a full month spent restoring 2 old Macs, and maybe to pre-justify spending another couple months restoring this original Apple II and Mac Classic, both of which have pretty interesting stories behind them. Until next time, I'm Jeff Geerling.